So they're looking at cost-cutting measures. It may end up at some smaller schools that they cut sports so they can afford to pay these athletes back pay.
Hey, Jimmy, you're in Destin, Florida right now for the SEC spring meetings. There's a lot that a lot of us want to know, and basically we just want to know what's being said from Greg Sankey and the other SEC coaches from the first couple of days. You know, what's your main takeaway from what's being said?
One of my main takeaways is I don't think they've ever had more topics to discuss. There is so much going on. There was a recent settlement of the House versus NCAA lawsuit in which the NCAA and schools have to pay $2.77 billion, some of it in back pay to athletes going back 10 years. There's the injury report situation. How are they going to handle that? There's a roster limitations in football. Most of the football coaches are upset about the idea that they may put a roster cap at 85, which means you can have 85 on scholarship and no walk-ons. So there's a concern about that. There's also the concern that they have agreed to give credentials to sports agents so they can be on the sideline during, for example, a football game. Why in the world would you allow that? But that's what they're doing. So, gosh, there are just so many elements of what's going on here. On the back burner is whether or not to go to 8 SEC conference games in football or go to 9. Because it's at 8 for the next 2 years, there are more pressing issues, so they're going to hardly even discuss the 8 versus 9 schedule because they're trying to figure out all these other things. I did find it interesting that when Lane Kiffin, Ole Miss's coach, was asked, do you think that the fact that you're in the NFL helps you deal with the transfer portal and name, image, and likeness? And he said, absolutely not. He said, in the NFL, they have a salary cap. In the NFL, they have multiple contracts. What we have in college football is chaos. So that kind of sums up what a lot of people feel like. One coach, Steve Sarkisian, said, I've learned not to complain because it doesn't do any good. I'll just take the rules as they are and deal with it and try to adjust. That's a pretty good attitude to take. I will say that not all football coaches have that attitude, but that's his attitude. One other thing, I talked to Rick Barnes, Tennessee basketball coach, about this, and I said, look, you went to Europe last year, and the result was your team bonded so well, you won the SEC regular season title, and you made it to the Elite Eight. Would you like to do that every year? He said, yes, because of the transfer portal, because there's so much roster change from year to year. But he said they will never agree to that because it's too expensive. But he liked the idea of making annual trips like that to have for team bonding.
Okay, so that was quite a run through of all the things that are going on. It seems more than not, the coaches are a little indifferent about what's going on right now. I want to start from the first thing you mentioned, $2.7 billion with a B.
Yeah.
How are they going to distribute that? What does that process look like for not only the back pay, but future as well?
22% revenue sharing is the number they've come up with in their agreement. So what will happen is the NCAA is going to disseminate less money to a lot of schools. Tennessee, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, all of them can handle that. Texas A&M, but smaller schools like MTSU, that's a big hit on their budget. That's more difficult for those schools. So they're trying to find some cost-cutting measures so that they can pay these athletes back pay and future pay. And by the way, percent revenue, that doesn't include the fact that athletes get cost of attendance, which at Tennessee is $5,666, and they get bonuses for being academically eligible. None of that's a part of this. So it's going to be difficult for a lot of these schools to make those kinds of payments. So they're looking at cost-cutting measures. It may end up at some smaller schools that they cut sports so they can afford to pay these athletes back pay.
Yeah, I was about to ask you that, especially for those smaller schools. You mentioned SEC can handle it, maybe not so much, these mid-major schools. How does that impact Title IX and other, as you may say, fringe sports at these colleges?
Yeah, the Title IX issue is interesting. So the football players, from what we're hearing, because that is the most revenue-producing sport, they want the most money. The next is men's basketball. That is the next most revenue-producing sport. Those are the only two sports in which there is consistent revenue producing. And I shouldn't say revenue, I should say net revenue.
Yes.
But women's basketball, there might be a couple of schools out there that make money. The Lady Vols have never made money. They've always been in a deficit, even when they They're at their zenith at Pat Summit. Connecticut may make money. Baseball, there are a couple of schools out there that might make money. Tennessee, I don't think is at that level right now, but LSU, Mississippi State might. So the football players want the biggest share. Okay, well, if you give them the bigger share, then how do you satisfy Title IX? How do you? One thought is you pay most of the money to the football players, men's basketball, and then all other sports you divide the money equally. The folks at Title IX going to agree to that? I don't know. So there are a lot of hurdles that they've got to clear before they can reach an agreement. And a lot of this is pending. There's the litigation out there that has not yet been satisfied. So a lot of these items they will discuss here, but they won't necessarily come up with a decision because they have not completed the litigation process.
What's the reaction from some of the coaches when they are kind of getting into the nitty-gritty of how to share revenue? Obviously, it's the football coaches talking, and you mentioned they deservingly want most of that share. What's their reaction and takeaway from kind of the narrative right now?
Have you seen the Heisman Trophy where the guy's stiff-arming?
Yeah, a few times.
Well, that's what we're seeing from the coaches. They're stiff-arming that. We don't have an answer. If one person said there are a lot smarter people in the room that are trying to figure that out than we are. So there hasn't been a solution mentioned by the football coaches. They're letting the attorneys and the legal folks handle it. Greg Sankey, the commissioner, is interesting. He was asked about what do you think of a Georgia quarterback, Jason Rashada, suing another SEC school and its coach, Florida, and Billy Napier. And he said simply, I don't like lawsuits. So, but you got that going on down here as well. And Billy Napier was interviewed, and I was right there with him. And he said, I can't discuss details because it's an ongoing investigation, but I feel comfortable with what I did, and I appreciate the support of the Florida administration.
Yeah, what does that do not only for Florida, but for Georgia in the midst of everything to have this lawsuit regarding NIL and not receiving verbal agreement type of money right now?
Yeah, so Kirby Smart from Georgia was asked about it, and he said, look, he was actually asked, did you endorse the lawsuit? He said, no, I was informed of the lawsuit. He said, but I'm not getting involved with that. He said, I knew the day before it was coming. Napier said he didn't even know he was in. He said, I found out I was in the lawsuit the same time you did. As soon as it was published, I had no idea I was going to be part of this lawsuit. So who knows what's going to happen with that? I don't know if Rashad is going to get his money off of a verbal agreement. Maybe he will. Right now, he's in Georgia with no NIL money. So that's going to be an interesting case to see how that gets resolved.
And I think in another layer, it's interesting because how does and what does NIL look like if we continue on with, paying athletes as employees? Is NIL and those collectives, are they still relevant in 2025?
Yeah, and that was a question that was fired at Greg Sankey, and he said, I don't really know. He said, I think his 2-word quote was, we'll see.
Love that.
Where that's going to go. Now, in regard to that, so you mentioned employees. Sankey said he has not had one student athlete come to him to say, I want to be an employee. Why? Because they get taxed. They get taxed on their scholarship money. They may even get taxed on the rehab treatment that they get. Are they going to have to buy insurance to take care of some of that kind of stuff? I don't think so. But they may end up having to pay tax on some of the like if you have a knee surgery, and how much does that cost? And if Tennessee pays for it, you have to pay taxes on that. There's a lot to unravel here with this situation. So I don't think they want to be employees because they don't want to be taxed on the scholarship money, right? Or cost of attendance, or staying eligible and getting an eligibility bonus. Now, on the other hand, they want to make some money. I was told that one of the things I think can help Paige in the transfer portal is if you have multi-year contracts on NIL deals. And there was a football coach yesterday, I can't name him, but there was a football coach that told me, yeah, we already have that. He said there are a lot of athletes that have multi-year NIL deals. I didn't know that because there are so many athletes that are, quote, free agents every year. They enter the portal every year. But he said, no, there are a number of them that do sign multi-year contracts. I think you'll see more multi-year contracts as schools try to protect themselves. They don't want a football, basketball player, any athlete to enter the portal as a free agent every year and negotiate a new contract every year. So I think you're going to see more and more of the multi-year contracts on NIL deals. Now, how does that affect the collectives? I think there's a pretty good chance that now the universities can pay directly to those players, that we'll see not a complete elimination of collectives, but a large reduction in the number of collectives that are out there.
It is kind of interesting how the tables are turning. You would play these really small schools like Austin Peay to help with their athletic department, and now you're needing more conference home games to help with your own athletic department. It's interesting how the pendulum is kind of swinging in that direction right now.
Yeah, it is. And, I had one person that was telling me, he said, look, I am for the I almost hesitate to call them student athletes anymore because I don't know how many of these people are going to class. By the way, there is a proposal from the SEC that said each school needs to come up with their attendance policy about going to class, doing this. You need to come up with some policy because this transfer stuff, a lot of these guys will transfer somewhere, not go to class, and transfer somewhere else. And how in the world they stay eligible, I don't know. So that's an issue out there in terms of what they're another thing that they're trying to deal with, and that's in one of the legislative bylaws that they will pass here. Yeah, so it'd be crazy to see how they work this out.
And kind of going back to like one of the earlier topics you had about the SEC as a whole being fine when it comes to revenue sharing, does it begin to start a new tiered system when you look at how much a Tennessee football program is able to bring in compared to a Florida program is going to be able to bring into? Because I know the athletic department for Tennessee eclipsed $200 million again last year. Will you see programs maybe separating themselves in that regard as it relates to maybe the transfer portal and guys wanting to go to a certain program because they're selling out their stadiums game after game and therefore having a larger amount within that 22%?
Yeah, I think there is a separation. I think eventually we're going to see a separation for football schools that are the power schools. What I don't think will happen is that there'll be a complete breakaway from the NCAA, because the NCAA oversees men's basketball, which makes a lot of money. They oversee baseball, softball. They oversee all the other sports. So I think you'll see some power teams within the league kind of break away, and it might be 60 teams, but it's still under the umbrella of the NCAA. But the NCAA kind of says, y'all set your own rules, and then we're going to govern all these other sports. While I'm leading in that direction, I will tell you this: Greg Sankey has been asked about future expansion within the SEC, and he said, "I've said this before. We are not looking to expand, but we also are observant about what's going on out there." Okay, in other words, what if the ACC implodes?
Yeah.
The SEC is not going to sit still and let the best teams go to the Big Ten or some other conference. So they're aware of that. So there has been some talk about, what schools would go to the SEC if the ACC implodes? I think the ACC is going to implode, and I think it'll be within the next couple of years. And then it would be interesting to see which teams join the SEC. I did have a conversation with an SEC official last night who said that Florida State has shown an interest in joining the SEC. Well, the SEC wanted Florida State to join, and you remember with our Roy Kramer interview.
I was about to say that.
Yeah, the SEC was interested in Florida State back in 1991, 92.
With Bobby Bowden, yeah.
Said no. Now the temperature has changed, and Florida State's interested in getting it. Would be interested in getting in the SEC, provided the ACC blows up. So that's been an interesting twist over the last 30-some-odd years.
Yeah, it's like you might not be looking, but I'm sure you definitely have a list in your back pocket of schools you would want in the conference, and that was a good workaround by Greg Sankey. And just kind of as we wrap up this interview, I know you got to get to other meetings and the rest of the spring meetings today. I've sensed that there's been a couple of funny moments that have happened maybe throughout the spring meetings, such as the nickname that the Alabama head coach might be garnering right now. Have you heard much about that?
What nickname did you hear?
Apparently his new last name, his nickname will be De'Boring, because he doesn't really offer much interesting things. And I just wanted to see, is that true? Has him and maybe other coaches been kind of boring this SEC spring meetings turn?
Well, yeah, and DeBoer didn't say a whole lot. I could see where that came. In fact, when he showed up at the meetings, he asked somebody at the concierge desk, okay, which way do I go to the meetings?
Oh, no.
Which was such a contrast because Nick Saban basically ran the meetings. He knew where to go. He knew what rooms. He also knew where to hide. The board will figure that out in due time. So Lane Kiffin was a lot of folks came out of there saying, that was kind of boring. Didn't get a lot out of Lane. Lane doesn't feel real comfortable in press conference settings. He's really good one-on-one. He's really good 2 or 3 on one. But you put 20, 25, 40 people in front of him, he kind of clams up. So he didn't really offer a lot last night during his press conference.
Yeah, maybe some fear of public speaking. You don't want to go viral for the wrong reasons during these meetings.
Yeah. Well, Eli Drinkwitz, speaking of that, he's declined interviews. And somebody said, why? And the answer was because he's afraid he's going to say something that'll make headlines.
I mean, this is the time for that to happen, so I feel like I get it. Awesome. Well, we'll loop back up later this week, see what Josh Heupel said. But, Jimmy, I appreciate you joining me and kind of breaking it down here on the podcast with us.
Paige, I appreciate it. Thank you very much. We'll talk to you later.
Okay.